Okay, we're doing the maze, and we got two. Anyone need another one of these? So let's read this problem. The marching band is selling poinsettias and wreaths to raise money for new uniforms. Trey sold 7 poinsettias and 3 wreaths and raised $201. Molly sold 4 poinsettias and 6 wreaths and raised $252. How much is a poinsettia? What's important there? As I said last class, the more people that participate, the faster this will go. Okay. What else? Wreaths. And $1. What else is important? Four poinsettias, 6 wreaths. What are we looking for? Then we need 2 variables. What do we want to call them?
X and Y.
You want to call them something else that's here? What would X and Y represent? Cost of the poinsettia and the cost of the wreath. So then we need to set up our 2 equations. We have 6 numbers, so we're going to use all of them in both equations. Use 3 of them in one and 3 in the other. So how would we set that up? Or at least one of them up. Okay, and then the other one? Right. This is set up really nicely for elimination. So we're going to solve that way. If we are looking for how much is a poinsettia, if we were to eliminate the cost of the wreaths or the y's, we would get our x. So to eliminate the y's, we would need to change this, one or both. How would we do that? By doing what? Okay, so we could just multiply the first one by 2 to make the y's the same. You could also change them both, multiply them both. You have options, it doesn't matter. So this new one would be 14x plus 6y equals 402. Then to eliminate our y's, we would add or subtract. We have negative 10x plus 0 equals 150. Double check that out for me. Was that accurate? Yes. And then if we divide, we would get 15 out. Okay, so then this next problem on the length will be familiar. We've seen it before, but when we were doing it previously, we didn't call it systems of equations. But for the length of a rectangle is 1 inch less than 3 times its width. If the perimeter of the rectangle is 54 inches, find the length. What's important here? That whole sentence. The perimeter is 54 inches, so we know what we're talking about. And what are we looking for? So because we're talking about length and width, our variables are just going to be L and W for length and width. If you want to be more specific, you could say length in inches, width in inches, but that's not necessary. Because we're talking about perimeter, we need to remember our equation for perimeter. In general, how do we find perimeter of any shape? So length plus the width of all the sides, so that would be length plus width plus length plus width of a rectangle. So we could rephrase that or rewrite it as P equals 2L plus 2W. That's in general. Specific to our problem, we know our perimeter is 54, so we can replace 4 with B. Then we have to set up our second equation, which is going to be that first sentence. The length of a rectangle is 1 inch less than 3 times its width. How do we set that up? Lizzie.
Yes, L equals 3W minus 1.
Less than, you would put it at the end, and then 3 times the width, and it's talking about the length. So again, when we were doing this previously, we didn't say this, but we were doing substitution. We're taking the equation and putting it into the other and solving. We're going to do that same thing here. But when we solve for L, we'll have to, when we substitute in for L, we'll be solving for W, which is not what the problem is asking for, and then we'll have to go back and solve that out. Go ahead and put that in for L and start to distribute. What is W? inches. So notice that that answer is up there, but that's not the answer we're looking for. We are looking for length. So we know it's gonna be 20, but we still need to show the work for that. We know our length equation was 3W minus 1. So use that to make sure our length is in fact 20. At this point, we either have minimum 1 more or maximum 2 more, because we could be done. We could go up, but then we can't keep going up because we already went that way, so then we would know the pathway would either end, or it would go here and end, or it would go here and we know the pathway ends. So max 2, minimum 1, let's figure out. Ariana's English test has 2 types of questions, multiple choice for 2 points each and short response for 3 points each. If there are 43 total questions and the test is worth 100 points, how many short response questions are there? What's important there? Forty-three questions total. Choice for 2 points. What else? Anything else? And what are we looking for? So then we need 2 variables. What do we want to call them? Sure. You had something else in mind, go for it. What would M and S represent? What about the multiple choice and the short answer, short response? Number of questions. So number of multiple choice and number of short response. Because we already know their worth. Right, this one has 4 numbers, so 3 of them are going to be used together. Then the other one is going to be off by itself. How would we set up these 2 equations? That'll be one of them. M plus S equals 43. Number of multiple choice plus number of short response would equal the total number of questions. And then the other? Equals 100. The work of the points and how many multiplied together. And the same thing for short response would give you the total amount of points for the entire test. Do you want to solve this by substitution or elimination? Okay. If we are solving by substitution, we are looking for short response. So if we solve for M, get M by itself, get rid of S. when we substitute that back in, we will have just as. Now, I believe I said this last time, but I'm not sure. It doesn't matter if you solve for the wrong variable first, you just have to go back and solve for the right variable. If it's only asking for one thing. Or if you solve for the right variable the first time, then you don't have equal. But if it asks for both, you have to do both regardless. So go ahead and put that in and distribute. Combine your like terms and solve for S. What is S? This would be 14 questions. One more. From this one, we already know we can't go up. It has to be 5, 9, or 4. So let's read this last one. Ben and Landon took turns driving on the recent 820-mile road trip. Ben averaged 60 miles per hour while Landon averaged 56 miles per hour. If the trip took them 14 hours, how many hours did Landon drive? What's important there? Hundred 20 miles. Miles per hour. I'm also going to say that that's for Ben. 56 for Landon. 14 hours total. So we need two variables. What do we want to call them? I'm going to capitalize them. Is that green or busy? So L and B would represent what? Number of hours Landon drove and Ben drove. This one again has 4 numbers. One of your totals is not at the end, so be careful there. How would we set up these two equations? Okay.
60.
Not 14, because these are number of miles. So what else is talking about number of miles? 800. The first part is good. 60B plus 56L equals 820. Those would go together, number of miles. And then the second one is going to equal 14. What would that one? How would we set that one up?
Plus.
Because number of hours plus number of hours equals total number of hours. Right, do we want to solve this by substitution or elimination?
Eliminate.
If we are solving by elimination, we need to get rid of B. To make these the same, we have to multiply this by 60. Sometimes elimination seems like the easier one, but then you have big numbers like this and you have to be careful as you're multiplying. I'm gonna rewrite them. 60B is 6,020. What is that? Apparently this one's too long, we won't let me extend it more. To eliminate our B's, would we add or subtract? I'm gonna write this down here and then grab a new. 0 minus 4L equals negative 20. So L would be 5 hours. And that would take us here. We can't go up, so that would have to come down. We can't go anywhere else but 12, and that would be the end. Done. Yeah. So then for the remainder of class, you have a few different things you can be working on. You want to go back and do the problems we didn't do, you're more than welcome to do that. I'm going to pass out a review. Your quiz is next class, your test the class after that next week. So I will be giving you your review. You can work on that. You can be working on Delta Math, the one that's due tomorrow, on word problems, the previous ones from last week or the 2 weeks before. There is no more retake work that had to be done yesterday, but those of you that I spoke to about retaking, if you uploaded everything, you could do that now if you don't want to stay after school today. But those things, you can be working on those things. Questions on what we're doing?